May 5, 1945. For 17 hours. Castle Itter, Austrian Tyrol. Captain Jack Lee of the U.S. Army 23rd Tank Battalion stood in the medieval castle's courtyard, watching the dawn light creep over the Austrian Alps, and tried to make sense of the radio message he'd received 30 minutes ago. A Wehrmacht officer was requesting American help to defend a castle full of French VIP prisoners against an SS attack. And now, looking at the men around him, Lee understood that this situation had gone beyond strange into territory that would redefine everything he thought he knew about the war's end. To his left stood Major Joseph Sepp Gangl of the Wehrmacht, the German officer who'd requested help, wearing his gray uniform with barely concealed contempt for the SS forces gathering in the valley below. To his right stood Captain François de la Roque, former leader of France's largest pre-war political party, now a prisoner in silk pajamas holding a rifle he barely knew how to use. Behind them, 10 American soldiers from Lee's tank destroyer unit checked weapons alongside a dozen Wehrmacht soldiers who 12 hours ago had been enemies. And in the valley, approximately 150 SS Totenkopfverband troops from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division were preparing to assault the castle, intent on executing the French VIP prisoners before American forces could liberate them. The SS were fanatical, desperate, willing to fight to the death even though Germany had officially surrendered 3 days ago. This was May 1945. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. Yet here, in an isolated Austrian castle, Americans and Germans were about to fight side by side against SS troops who refused to accept that the Reich had fallen. And if they lost this battle, some of France's most prominent political and military leaders would be executed in the final hours of World War II. Captain Lee checked his Thompson submachine gun and looked at the unlikely alliance he'd assembled in the past 6 hours. "Gentlemen," he said in English, which Major Gangl translated to German and French for those who needed it. "In about 30 minutes, approximately 150 SS troops are going to try to kill everyone in this castle. We have 14 American soldiers, 10 Wehrmacht soldiers, and whatever help the prisoners can provide. We're outnumbered 6-1. The castle walls are medieval and weren't designed for modern weapons. We have limited ammunition and no reinforcements coming." He paused, looking at the faces around him. Americans barely out of their teens. German soldiers who'd fought for 6 years and were exhausted by a war they'd lost. French prisoners who'd spent years in captivity and now held weapons for the first time since being arrested. "But we have a castle," Lee continued. "We have walls. We have high ground. And we have something they don't have. We're fighting to save lives, not take them. That makes us worth 10 of them. So we're going to hold this position until reinforcements arrive or until every one of us is dead. Questions?" Major Gangl stepped forward. "Captain Lee, my men and I will hold the north wall. It's the most exposed position and we're most familiar with SS tactics. It's appropriate that Germans defend against Germans in this fight." "Agreed," Lee nodded, then turned to the French prisoners. "Messers, I know most of you haven't fired weapons in years, some never at all. But if you can hold a rifle and pull a trigger, you'll be on the walls. Anyone who can't fight will shelter in the keep." Former French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, who had declared war on Germany in 1939 and now stood in Austrian castle preparing to fight alongside German soldiers, raised his hand. "Captain, I've never fired a military weapon. But I will learn quickly. Teach me what I need to know." This was the moment that would become legend. The battle where enemies became allies. The fight where Americans, Germans, and French stood together against fanatics who refused to accept that the war was over. The defense of Castle Itter, the strangest battle of World War II, was about to begin. The story of how this impossible alliance came to exist began 3 days earlier, on May 2, 1945, when the SS guards at Castle Itter abandoned their posts. The castle, located in the Austrian Tyrol near Wurgl, had been converted into a high-security prison in 1943 to hold French VIP prisoners. These weren't ordinary POWs. They were former French prime ministers, generals, tennis champions, and political leaders whom the Germans considered too important or too dangerous to release, but too valuable to execute. The prisoners included Édouard Daladier, Prime Minister of France during the declaration of war against Germany; Paul Reynaud, who had succeeded Daladier as Prime Minister and had been in office when France fell; General Maurice Gamelin, who had commanded all French forces at the start of the war. General Maxime Weygand, who had replaced Gamelin and overseen France's defeat. Marie-Agnes Caillot, sister of Charles de Gaulle. Jean Barotra, the famous tennis champion. And over a dozen other French political and military figures. For 2 years, they'd lived in castle captivity, guarded by SS troops, isolated from the outside world. They'd been treated relatively well by concentration camp standards, fed adequately, allowed to interact with each other, but always aware they could be executed at any moment if Germany decided they were more valuable dead than alive. On May 2nd, with American forces approaching and Germany collapsing, the SS guards simply left. They removed their uniforms, changed into civilian clothes, and disappeared into the Austrian countryside, abandoning their posts and their prisoners. The French VIPs suddenly found themselves free but trapped. Free because there were no guards. Trapped because they were in a remote Austrian castle surrounded by SS units that might execute them before Americans arrived. The senior prisoner, Edouard Daladier, immediately recognized their danger. "We're in the middle of nowhere," he told the other prisoners. "The nearest American forces are miles away and don't know we're here. There are SS units all around us who would consider executing French political leaders a final service to the Reich. We need help. We need it now." The castle's caretaker, Alois Mayer, had remained at his post. He was a local Austrian who'd worked at the castle before it became a prison and had continued working during the occupation. Now he volunteered to get help. "There's a Wehrmacht garrison in Wurgel, about 5 miles from here," Mayer said. "The commander is Major Gangel. I know him. He's a good man, not a Nazi. He's been protecting civilians from SS units. Maybe he'll help." Mayer cycled to Wurgel and found Major Gangel at his headquarters. What he told Gangel presented the German officer with an impossible situation and a moral choice that would define the rest of his life. Major Joseph Sepp Gangel was 43 years old, a career Wehrmacht officer who'd fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He was not a Nazi. He joined the German army in 1918, had served continuously, had followed orders throughout the war while privately despising the Nazi regime. Now, in May 1945, with Germany defeated and Hitler dead, Gangel faced a choice that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier: help French VIP prisoners or abandon them to SS execution. "Let me understand this correctly," Gangel said to Mayer. "Castle Itter holds French political prisoners, former prime ministers and generals. The SS guards have abandoned them, but there are SS units in the area who will likely execute the prisoners if they find them unguarded. And you want me to help defend French prisoners against German SS troops?" "Yes, Major. Do you understand what you're asking? I would be fighting against German soldiers. I would be a traitor by any definition." "The war is over, Major. Germany has surrendered. The SS troops are acting without orders, without authority. They're fanatics who refuse to accept defeat. Helping these prisoners isn't treason. It's human decency." Gangel stood silent for long minutes, considering. He'd followed orders for 6 years. He'd fought for Germany even as he'd watched the Nazi regime commit atrocities that made him sick. He'd stayed silent, done his duty, told himself he was a soldier, not a politician. But now, with the war over, with Germany defeated, he had the chance to do one thing right. To save lives instead of taking them. To end his war doing something good instead of something he'd regret. "I'll help," Gangel said. "But I need authorization from the Americans. I won't fight Germans under German command. But if Americans ask for my assistance defending the prisoners, then I'm helping Americans, not fighting Germans. Do you understand the distinction?" "I understand, Major." "Good. Then let's find some Americans." Finding Americans proved easier than expected. American forces from the 23rd Tank Battalion had reached Kufstein, just a few miles from Wurgel. Gangel and several of his men approached American lines under a white flag, surrendered formally, and then explained the situation at Castle Itter. The American officer they met was Captain Jack Lee, a tank destroyer commander from New York who'd been fighting across Europe since D-Day. Lee listened to Gangel's broken English explanation of French VIP prisoners, SS troops preparing to attack, and a Wehrmacht officer offering to help defend them. It sounded insane. It sounded like a trap, but Gangel's earnestness was convincing, and Lee's intelligence officers confirmed that Castle Itter existed and had been used as a high-security prison. Major Gangel, Lee said carefully. You're asking me to trust a German officer I just met to lead my soldiers into a castle surrounded by SS troops. You understand why I'm skeptical. I understand completely, Captain, but I'm offering my men and myself as hostages. We'll go to the castle ahead of you. If it's a trap, you'll lose nothing but some German prisoners who were already your prisoners. If it's real, you'll save some very important French lives. Lee considered. The logic was sound. If it was a trap, he'd lose nothing. If it was real, he'd be saving VIP prisoners and potentially securing intelligence from French political and military leaders. All right, Major, we'll do this. But my men will be watching your men very carefully. Any sign of betrayal, and we'll shoot first and investigate later. Understood and accepted, Captain. That's how. On the evening of May 4th, 1945, an American tank destroyer carrying 14 American soldiers and 10 Wehrmacht soldiers drove through Austrian countryside toward Castle Itter. The Germans kept their weapons, which made the American soldiers nervous, but Lee had decided that if they were going to defend a castle against SS troops, they needed everyone armed. They reached Castle Itter at 2300 hours. The French prisoners, who'd been anxiously waiting since Mayer's departure, couldn't believe what they were seeing. American soldiers and German soldiers arriving together. Wehrmacht troops who days ago had been their guards now carrying weapons to defend them. Edouard Daladier approached Captain Lee. Captain, I speak some English. I'm Edouard Daladier, former Prime Minister of France. On behalf of all prisoners here, thank you for coming. But I must ask, are we certain about trusting these German soldiers? Lee glanced at Major Gangle, who stood nearby. Sir, I'm not certain about anything. But Major Gangle and his men voluntarily surrendered to us, volunteered to help defend you, and are putting themselves at tremendous risk. SS troops will execute them as traitors if we lose. That's enough for me to trust them for now. Then we trust them, Daladier agreed. This is strange world we're living in, Captain. I declared war on Germany in 1939. Now, 6 years later, German soldiers are defending me against other Germans. History will find this difficult to explain. Throughout the night of May 4th to 5th, Lee, Gangle, and the prisoners prepared Castle Itter's defenses. The castle dated to medieval times, built on a hill overlooking the Brixental Valley. It had thick stone walls, a central keep, and a gatehouse, but it hadn't been designed for modern warfare. Machine gun fire could penetrate windows. Artillery would devastate the old stone. The castle's defensive advantage was elevation and walls that would force attackers to advance uphill across open ground under fire. Lee positioned his men carefully. Americans took the south and east walls, with clear fields of fire down to the valley. Wehrmacht soldiers under Gangle held the north and west walls, the most exposed positions where SS troops would likely concentrate their attack. The French prisoners, those willing and able to fight, were distributed along the walls with rifles and basic instruction on how to use them. The castle's inhabitants that night made for the strangest garrison in military history. American soldiers from New York, Texas, and California who'd been fighting Germans for a year. Wehrmacht soldiers from Bavaria and Austria who'd fought for Germany across Europe. French politicians and generals who'd been prisoners for years. A famous tennis champion learning to fire a rifle. A former prime minister who declared war on Germany, now sleeping in a room guarded by German soldiers. At 4 o'clock hours, observers reported movement in the valley below. SS troops were gathering, approximately 150 men from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. These weren't regular Wehrmacht soldiers surrendering peacefully. These were SS fanatics, many from concentration camp guard units, who knew they'd face war crimes trials if captured. They had nothing to lose, and they were determined to fight. Their commander, SS Hauptsturmführer George Bachmann, had learned about the French VIP prisoners at Castle Itter and had seen an opportunity. Executing prominent French prisoners would be a final blow against the Allies, a last service to the Reich. He'd gathered his remaining forces and moved on the castle, expecting to overwhelm whatever token guard remained. What Bachmann didn't know was that the castle was now defended by a combined American-German-French force that was prepared to fight to the death. At 4:17 hours, as dawn light touched the Austrian Alps, the SS attack began. The first indication was small arms fire from the treeline below the castle. SS troops, using cover, fired rifles and machine guns at the castle walls, testing defenses, trying to identify defensive positions. The defenders returned fire carefully, conserving ammunition, waiting for targets. At 4:30, the SS launched their first assault. Approximately 40 troops advanced up the hill toward the castle's main gate, firing as they came, trying to rush the defenses before the defenders could concentrate fire. This was standard SS shock tactics, fast, aggressive, relying on speed and violence to overwhelm defenders. But the defenders at Castle Itter weren't the token guard force Bachmann expected. Machine gun fire from American positions caught the advancing SS troops in crossfire. Wehrmacht soldiers, who understood SS tactics intimately, predicted movement and fired ahead of targets. French prisoners, many of them former military officers, followed instructions and added their rifles to the defensive fire. The first assault broke before reaching the castle walls. SS troops fell back to the tree-line, leaving dead and wounded on the hillside. But the defenders knew this was just a probe. The SS were testing defenses, learning positions, preparing for a coordinated assault. At 5 o'clock, the second assault came from multiple directions simultaneously. SS troops advanced from the north, west, and south, attempting to split defensive fire and overwhelm the walls through simultaneous pressure. This was more sophisticated, better coordinated, and far more dangerous. Major Gangel's Wehrmacht troops on the north wall bore the brunt of this assault. Approximately 60 SS troops advanced on their position, using cover, firing, and moving in small unit tactics that German soldiers knew well because they'd been trained in the same doctrine. Gangel's men returned fire with disciplined precision, each shot aimed, each burst controlled. Conserve ammunition, Gangel shouted to his men in German. Aim fire only. Make every bullet count. We have to hold until American reinforcements arrive. On the south wall, Captain Lee directed his American troops with the same message. Short bursts. Pick your targets. Don't waste ammunition on suppressive fire. We need every round. The French prisoners, many of whom had never been under fire, performed better than anyone expected. Former General Maurice Gamelin, who'd commanded French forces at the war's start and hadn't fired a weapon in over a decade, calmly sighted his rifle and fired at SS troops below. Tennis champion Jean Barotra moved along the walls, carrying ammunition, encouraging other prisoners, and occasionally firing his rifle with surprising accuracy. At 5:15, the SS pulled back again, having failed to breach the walls. But ammunition was becoming critical. Lee's men had started with approximately 200 rounds per man. After 90 minutes of fighting, most were down to fewer than 50 rounds. Gangel's Wehrmacht troops were in similar condition. The French prisoners had even less. We can't sustain another assault like that, Lee told Gangel during the brief lull. We're running out of ammunition. The castle's defensive position is good, but we don't have enough bullets to hold against determined attacks. Where are the reinforcements? They should be here, Gangel replied. I sent runners to American lines before we left Wurgel. But the roads are difficult and there's still fighting in the area. We may have to hold longer than expected. At 5:30, the SS launched their third assault, and this time they brought anti-tank weapons. A Panzerfaust rocket struck the castle's gatehouse, blowing a hole in the medieval stone. SS troops rushed the breach, attempting to enter the castle courtyard. Wehrmacht soldiers counterattacked immediately. Gangel personally led a squad to the gatehouse, firing his MP-40 submachine gun at SS troops trying to enter. American soldiers joined the counterattack, and for several minutes the fighting was desperate, close range, in the confined space of the castle entrance. SS troops who made it through the breach were killed in the courtyard. Those who remained outside were driven back by concentrated fire. But the defenders had used tremendous ammunition in the counterattack. Many American and German soldiers were down to their last magazines. At 5:45, Major Gangel moved to a damaged section of the north wall, directing his men's fire, coordinating with the French prisoners on the ramparts. An SS sniper, positioned in the tree-line below, saw the German officer in Wehrmacht uniform and took careful aim. The single shot struck Gangel in the head. He fell instantly, killed at his post in the final hours of World War II, fighting against German troops to defend French prisoners alongside American soldiers. His death was witnessed by both his Wehrmacht soldiers and the American troops who'd been watching him carefully just hours ago, uncertain whether to trust him. A young Wehrmacht private, tears running down his face, shouted in German, "The Major is dead. They killed Major Gangel." The effect on the Wehrmacht troops was immediate. Their commander, the man who'd led them through the impossible situation of fighting fellow Germans, was gone. They could have broken. They could have surrendered. Instead, they fought harder. "For Major Gangel," one soldier shouted, firing his rifle in controlled bursts at the SS positions. "He died saving French lives. We hold this position. We finish what he started." The Americans, watching this, understood something profound. These weren't enemy soldiers fighting alongside them temporarily. These were allies who'd committed fully to the defense, who'd lost their commander and continued fighting. Lee made a decision. Wehrmacht soldiers on the North Wall. Lee shouted in English, which was quickly translated to German. "You're under my command now. Major Gangel died a hero. We hold this castle in his honor. We hold until reinforcements arrive or until every one of us is dead alongside him." At 6 o'clock, with ammunition critical and defenses weakening, someone on the south wall spotted dust on the road from Wurgel. Vehicles, multiple vehicles, coming fast. "Captain," an American soldier shouted. "Vehicles approaching from the south. I count 4. No, 5 Sherman tanks. And half-tracks. It's ours. Reinforcements are here." The defenders erupted in cheers. American M4 Sherman tanks from the 142nd Infantry Regiment appeared on the road, their 75mm main guns and 50 caliber machine guns immediately engaging SS positions in the valley. The SS, suddenly facing armor support they couldn't counter, broke contact and retreated into the forest. By 6:30, the battle was over. American reinforcements had secured the area. The SS troops had fled or surrendered. Castle Itter was safe. The French VIP prisoners had survived. The final count revealed the battle's strange nature. Defending the castle, 14 American soldiers, 10 Wehrmacht soldiers, and approximately 15 French prisoners who'd taken up arms. Attacking, approximately 150 SS troops. Duration, 2 hours and 30 minutes. American and Wehrmacht casualties, 1 killed, Major Gangel, several wounded. French casualties, none. SS casualties, at least 20 killed, dozens wounded, over 100 captured or dispersed. The aftermath was complex and emotional. The French prisoners, liberated after years of captivity, struggled to process that their liberation had been partially achieved by German soldiers. Edouard Daladier, who declared war on Germany 6 years earlier, personally thanked the surviving Wehrmacht troops for their sacrifice. "You fought for us," Daladier told them through a translator. "You died for us." Major Gangel gave his life defending French prisoners against German troops. This is beyond politics or nationality. This is humanity. We will remember this. France will remember this. Captain Lee recommended Major Gangel posthumously for recognition, though the bureaucracy of honoring a German soldier was complicated. Gangel's widow received his belongings and a letter from Lee describing how her husband had died defending French civilians and working alongside American forces. Years later, a street in Wurgel would be named Joseph Gangelgasse in his honor, one of the few German officers of World War II to be publicly honored for his actions. The American soldiers returned to their units with a story nobody quite believed. "You fought alongside Wehrmacht troops?" their commanders asked. "Against SS troops? To defend French prisoners? That sounds made up." But it wasn't made up. The documentation existed. The French VIP prisoners confirmed every detail. The surviving Wehrmacht soldiers testified about the battle. Photographs showed the damaged castle and the strange alliance that had defended it. The Battle of Castle Itter became footnote in most World War II histories, too strange to fit conventional narratives. It was the only time during World War II that Americans and Germans officially fought as allies against a common enemy. It was the last significant combat action in Europe, occurring 3 days after Germany's surrender. And it demonstrated that even in war's final hours, even after 6 years of killing, enemies could become allies when fighting for something that transcended nationalism. The French prisoners returned to France as heroes. Edouard Daladier resumed political life, though he never held office again. Paul Reynaud wrote extensively about the war. General Gamelin testified at various tribunals. Jean Barotra returned to tennis and sports administration. They all told the story of Castle Itter, of the German officer who died defending them, of the Americans who trusted that German officer, of the impossible alliance that held for a few hours one May morning. The Wehrmacht soldiers who survived returned to civilian life in Austria. They were not prosecuted for their wartime service because their actions at Castle Itter demonstrated they'd rejected Nazi ideology and fought to save lives. Several maintained contact with the French prisoners they defended, correspondence that lasted decades. The American soldiers remembered the battle as proof that war could end in ways more complicated than simple victory or defeat. Enemies could recognize shared humanity. Soldiers could fight for something beyond nationalism. And in war's final hours, men who'd spent years trying to kill each other could stand together on castle walls, defending the innocent. The historical significance of Castle Itter extended beyond the immediate battle. It demonstrated several truths about wars and that historians would spend decades analyzing. First, it showed that not all German soldiers were Nazis. Major Gangl and his men had fought for Germany, but had done so as soldiers following orders, not as ideological fanatics. When given the chance to do something right, to save lives instead of taking them, they'd seize that opportunity even at the cost of their lives. Second, it proved that SS fanaticism posed a danger even after Germany's surrender. The 150 SS troops who attacked Castle Itter weren't acting under orders from any legitimate authority. They were fighting for a Reich that no longer existed, trying to kill prisoners who no longer threatened anything. This mindset would persist in some SS veterans for years, refusing to accept that their cause had been defeated. Third, it validated American willingness to accept former enemies as allies when circumstances changed. Captain Lee's decision to trust Major Gangl and arm Wehrmacht troops demonstrated pragmatism that would characterize post-war American policy in Germany. Former enemies could become allies if they demonstrated shared values and commitment to democratic principles. The battle influenced post-war German Reconstruction policy. American occupation authorities cited Castle Itter as evidence that not all Wehrmacht soldiers needed to be treated as war criminals. This distinction between Wehrmacht and SS, between soldiers and fanatics, shaped denazification policy and helped facilitate Germany's eventual integration into Western alliance structures. French prisoners' testimony about German soldiers fighting to defend them contributed to nuanced understanding of German military culture. Not every German soldier had been a Nazi. Many had simply been soldiers doing their duty, and some had privately opposed the regime while following orders. This understanding didn't excuse Wehrmacht participation in atrocities, but it allowed for more sophisticated analysis than simply labeling all German soldiers as equally culpable. The tactical lessons from Castle Itter influenced post-war military doctrine about defensive operations. A small force in fortified position with combined arms support had held against numerically superior attackers. The successful defense validated theories about fortification, defensive firepower, and combined American-German tactical doctrines being compatible when coordinated properly. Modern military historians study Castle Itter as a unique case study in alliance formation under extreme circumstances. How do former enemies cooperate effectively in combat? What factors enable trust between forces that were trying to kill each other days earlier? How do language barriers and cultural differences get overcome during coordinated defensive operations? The answers from Castle Itter suggest that shared immediate threat, clear common purpose, and leaders willing to trust each other can overcome years of enmity surprisingly quickly. Gangl and Lee established working relationship within hours. Their soldiers followed that leadership and cooperated effectively despite language difficulties and recent hostilities. The French prisoners' role in their own defense demonstrated that civilians could contribute meaningfully to military operations when properly armed and directed. Former Prime Minister WWII firing a rifle alongside the tennis champion Barotra showed that political and military leadership could translate into combat effectiveness even for those long removed from military service. The battle's timing, occurring 3 days after Germany's official surrender, highlighted the complexity of war's end. Surrender documents don't immediately end all hostilities. Fanatical elements continue fighting. local situations remained dangerous. The transition from war to peace isn't a clean switch, but rather a messy process where combat can continue even after the war officially ends. Castle Itter's defense lasted approximately 2.5 hours of sustained combat. In that time, fewer than 40 effective defenders held off 150 attackers through superior position, coordinated fire, and mutual support between American, German, and French forces. The force ratio suggested defenders should have been overwhelmed, but defensive advantages and effective leadership overcame numerical inferiority. Post-battle analysis estimated defenders fired approximately 4,000 rounds of small arms ammunition during the fight, averaging about 100 rounds per defender. This was remarkably efficient compared to typical World War II combat, where tens of thousands of rounds might be expended per casualty. The accuracy reflected a combination of defensive advantages, careful fire discipline, and defenders fighting for their lives knowing ammunition was limited. The single-tank destroyer that Lee had positioned overlooking the castle's approach roads never fired its main gun during the battle. The psychological effect of having armor support was significant even without the gun being used. SS troops knew attempting to assault uphill while under potential anti-tank fire would be suicidal, constraining their tactical options. Major Gangel's death from a sniper shot highlighted the danger that leadership faces in combat. As the most experienced officer on the North Wall, Gangel had been directing fire and coordinating defense, making himself a target. His loss could have collapsed that section of the defense, but his soldiers fought harder in his memory, demonstrating how effective leadership builds resilience even after the leader is gone. The lack of French casualties was partially luck, but also reflected Gangel's defensive positioning. He'd placed the least experienced fighters, the French prisoners, in positions with good cover and fields of fire that didn't require them to expose themselves extensively. The more exposed positions were held by American and Wehrmacht soldiers with combat experience who understood how to use cover effectively. The arrival of American reinforcements at the critical moment appeared coincidental but reflected pre-planned coordination. Lee had sent runners back to American lines before moving to the castle. The reinforcements had been organized and were moving toward Castle Itter when the battle started. Their arrival timing was fortunate, but not accidental. The SS troops' retreat once armor appeared demonstrated typical infantry response to encountering armor without adequate anti-tank weapons. The Panzerfaust they'd used against the gatehouse was likely their only anti-tank capability. Facing multiple Sherman tanks, SS troops made the rational decision to withdraw rather than face annihilation. The battle's aftermath created complex political situations. The French prisoners wanted to honor Major Gangel and the Wehrmacht soldiers who defended them. But honoring German soldiers in 1945 was politically problematic. France was still processing collaboration and occupation. Publicly celebrating Wehrmacht troops, even those who'd fought to save French lives, would be controversial. The compromise solution involved private recognition and years later, public acknowledgement. Gangel received no immediate official recognition, but his actions were documented. Decades later, Austrian and German historians would ensure his story was told accurately, presenting him as a complex figure who'd served Germany but ended his life doing something unquestionably good. The American soldiers received no special recognition for the battle. It was classified as a routine engagement during the war's final days. Only later would historians recognize its unique nature and the precedent it set for American-German cooperation. The soldiers themselves told the story informally, often to skeptical audiences who thought they were exaggerating or making it up. The strategic value of saving the French VIP prisoners extended beyond their individual importance. These were men who'd led France before the fall, who had institutional knowledge and political networks that would be valuable in post-war reconstruction. Their survival and grateful testimony about American operations provided diplomatic benefits that lasted for years. Edouard Deladier's post-liberation testimony included extensive praise for American military professionalism and German soldiers' willingness to defend French prisoners.